How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Tom. How are
Congrats
you?
on the film, man.
Thank you so
I
much.
really loved watching it.
Thank you.
So I want to set up a little bit. I mean, I want to start with the obvious. When did David Bowie's music first come into your life?
Well, I don't know if it was puberty or Bowie, but they both kind of had the same impact in my life in kind of introducing me to a kind of consciousness. It's very cliche when I answer this question because I feel like almost everyone who came to Bowie came at this critical age in their life where he kind of is our passport to culture, to identity, to identification. And for me, musically, he was the first artist I curated on my own. That it wasn't from my parents, and that opened up the doors to the Clash and to Black Flag and to a whole host of music. So it was really important in terms of my own sort of cultural growth and sort of personal evolution.
But I think to ask that is to wonder. You could say a lot of different eras too. Like some people would.
Oh,
say,
I'm sorry. I'm
some
53.
some people
Yeah.
would say like, oh, it was the Ziggy Stardust stuff that got me, or it was the Modern Love stuff that got me, or it was the SNL German stuff that what was that? For
So
you?
I'm 53, so it was Scary Monsters.
Oh yeah.
So by the time Let's Dance came out, I was like kind of a little bit of a petulant, like 13 or 14-year-old who, sort of thought he was turning away a little bit, with the sort of teenage attitude one has. But it was Scary Monsters that brought me into the fold, and then I immediately went to Ziggy Stardust and earlier.
And had that been in your mind for a while to make a film about him?
No, I had met with him in 2007.
You met with him.
Yeah, to discuss collaborating on a hybrid nonfiction film. And it was going to involve him doing a lot of performance, acting. And at the time, he was in semi-retirement because of his heart attack. So after the meeting, his executor, or his now executor, who was then his manager, called me and said, "David, really enjoyed the meeting, but the time's not. It's not a good time right now." And so I went on with my life. I made this Kurt Cobain film montage of Heck, and when I finished that, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and I decided I wanted to do something that I was at the time calling the IMAX music experience. And the idea from conception was that it would be no biography, no facts, no information, almost like a planetarium show built around my favorite musical artists, almost like extracting wine from a grape. Just the very essence. If you can find it or see it or read it on Wikipedia, I don't want it in the film. So it was, that was the concept. And
Why? Is because you wanted to access something deeper
I don't
in the
because-
artist rather than something biographical about them?
Yeah, because I wanted to do a cinematic adaptation of these artists that's not biographical.
That more transmits the feeling that the artists give you?
Perhaps, yeah. But the idea was to try this kind of experiment adventure in can one create a experience that's not biographically orientated, and I'll tell you why even more so because I find it to be sort of I find the genre to be redundant for me creatively. The bio doc is basically such a well-trodden path of then this, then the first success, then this.
The
then,
shot of the childhood home.
it's not my thing.
Interview with the person who grew up in the backyard.
Since I've been making films, or going back to the Kid Stays in Picture, my primary interest is in theatrical experiences and what can I offer audiences that they can't get from a book. That's my objective. These films, someone like David Bowie, there's 36 books on David Bowie. There's some really amazing documentaries. The 5 Years series on BBC, I highly recommend. They're very informative. So it's really well trodden. I try to make a film that if you have a deep knowledge of Bowie, you can fill in the blanks. And if you have no knowledge of Bowie, you shouldn't be lost. You should be fine.
I understand now what you mean because I was moved but curious of the first, say, 30, 40 minutes of the film, which felt to me like this theatrical experience of David Bowie's music. It's a concert. It's I don't want to say what your work is, but to me it was far more of the experience of. Go ahead.
Well, it's not a film about David Bowie.
Of course.
It's a film that is trying through form to kind of create the Bowie experience. It's designed to be If you let me ask you, describe David Bowie to me.
I don't know if
Okay.
I can. Yeah.
So
yeah.
enigmatic,
Sorry, I can try my best. Enigmatic, creative,
mysterious,
individualistic,
yeah,
mysterious, groundbreaking,
sublime, intimate. Blah,
sure.
blah, blah. That's the film.
Mm-hmm.
So it's designed to kind of mirror and to create it, to craft it. I spent years kind of studying his sort of techniques to art and his methodologies and employed them to create the film.
Give me an example of a methodology you got from David Bowie.
I'll give you my favorite one. I see a person over there who's got a Kurt Cobain shirt. Nice. That was so meta. I just broke the wall, right?
Oh yeah, the whole thing's about to collapse.
Yeah. So I'm like, I think a lot of people in my trade, I consider myself a perfectionist. My job is to sort of look at a frame and figure out what's wrong with it until I can't figure out anything else to do, and then I go to the next frame. Not shot per se, but frame. Bowie preaches that virtuosity is overrated, and what he's really trying to do is timestamp a moment when he's recording, and to that extent, there's almost no sort of alternate versions of his songs. What he would go down to one or two tracks, and that was something I really had to embrace. So there's this idea that Bowie has that there's no mistakes, just happy accidents. If you saw my film, it's 70% editorially were probably mistakes that I would sort of look back on and were like, oh, that's okay, let's leave it. I wanted to create something that felt spontaneous, that could tap into that kind of energy that David had when he was creating his art. So that was one. But there were several. I mean, there was David, when he worked with Brian Eno in Berlin, they used to have this sort of book, this thing called Oblique Strategies. It's a whole bunch of ideas that try to get you out of your kind of comfort zone, which was easy for me on this film because I didn't have a staff and I'm not really an editor. So there was no way for me to be a virtuoso in the edit room, which was quite an advantage, unfortunately, in this case, I think.
This is fascinating that you employed some of the methodology you got from David Bowie to make the film involving the experience of David Bowie is probably the best way I can say it. You also had access to, I think, 5 million assets belonging to the Bowie estate. What's the process of going through that?
So they provided me with everything that they had in their archive, and then we complemented that with a global search, including CBC and everywhere else on Earth that had David Bowie media, so that by the time I finished screening, which took 2 years, I felt very confident that I had seen every piece of Bowie media, both known and unknown, which gave me a sort of great vantage point to sort of discover and unearth the through line that the film would sort of wrap itself around, which is transience for the most part.
Chaos and transience.
Chaos, fragmentation, transience in whatever form.
What does that mean? Tell me what that means.
Well, the popular mythology with David is if you go up to most people and you say, what's the through line of Bowie's career? They would say change.
Folk singer at the beginning, folk singer, pop singer, started out and then glam rock and then into changing over the years.
Well, even
Disco
character to character.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
going from Ziggy Stardust to Aladdin Sane to Halloween Jack to the Thin White Duke to the pop star in the 80s.
The industrial thing in the 90s. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So and I think that implies, well, he has a song called Changes. So I think that was, sort of became his moniker. There's a hilarious interview I read with him, or I saw it with him later in his career with, I think it was Entertainment News, which ironically was one of my favorite interviews. Like, last place you would expect to find like the amazing David Bowie interview, but he had just met him on, and he said, most people think my through line is changes, but really it should be transients.
Oh,
and what transients enabled me to do was build the film, create a narrative for the film that really hopefully addressed or got to the essence of Bowie as an artist and of his interests, and tried to sort of get into his mind, his imagination of his pursuits. I took a very loose interpretation of transience, so that there was a spiritual component to it. There was a creative and artistic, David employing the cutout process that Burroughs invented, gender fluidity, transit. David was always, never wanted a home.
Never owned a home.
Never owned a home. So there were all these ideas that I could sort of thread together without creating a biographical narrative. And then ultimately what I did was I was having a really hard time breaking the script because I knew it was going to deal with chaos and fragmentation and all of these lofty ideas, but I didn't know how to structure it without feeling too overtly narrative. And then I had this, 8 months into I was working in my office. I had writer's block. I couldn't unravel how to do it. So one day I drove to the airport. I pulled up to the office, was like, I'm not going in there today. Went to the airport, got on a plane to go to Albuquerque, got on a train, and the second the train started moving, the script started pouring out of me. And by the way, that's another Bowie 101 is get out of your comfort zone. That was where I took that input to get on a train. And I learned that he liked to write in transit, and it worked. I mean, the second the train started moving, I started thinking of the Iliad, which I hadn't been thinking of it in those terms. And I started thinking of David in the context of Joseph Campbell. And I was thinking that if I consider for a moment that he was creating his own storms for himself, right? That he was putting himself to the test every day almost, that there would be a way to kind of structure the film with this kind of hero's journey, which didn't need to be forced. I mean, it was his journey, and he was a sailor, and he was one of the great creative adventurers and explorers of our lifetime.
What is something you discovered in David Bowie's work in the 5 million pieces that might surprise me or might surprise somebody?
I'll tell you right now. The first thing that comes to mind is during the 70s, most of the music journalists were very on the same plane with David. The rock journalists of that period had the same reference point, so they could talk about Bertolt Brecht or Kandinsky or whatever it was that they wanted to engage in, or chaos and fragmentation, or Joyce and Einstein and Freud, and the sort of breaking down of our sort of belief system at the turn of the century. I mean, that was what really excited David, talking about stuff like that. And then, as he went mainstream, suddenly the reporters who were showing up to interview him they weren't familiar with his music. They just knew this sort of iconography. And there was this one moment where he was sitting down, and I kind of want to say in Canada, but I don't want to implicate anyone, with a sort of music television reporter who clearly had very little idea who David was. And I was like, oh, this is, yeah. And then during the preamble, before it went to air, during the time when the cameras were running, and they were just talking, David had this really engaged conversation with her about the books that he had been reading, and wanted to find out from her what she had been reading, and noted it down what she had been reading. And it was in that moment that I realized that he viewed every moment in life as an opportunity for an exchange. And he was always present. I mean, this is someone who really, it wasn't accidental. He really tried to absorb. And what I think is so heroic, and again, I sort of framed him as in the spirit of a explorer adventure, is that when most of us achieve a level of success, we cling to it. No one wants to put it on the line. And David did it time and time and time again. When he goes to Berlin and he's like, I'm not going to write songs anymore. I'm going to just do this theoretical, create a new language of music. He actually did create a new language of music. And guess what? They were huge hits. It was, so, when I think of today's musicians, even musicians of that era, this is very specific to David. And I think it's a reason to celebrate a life that was incredibly well lived.
One part of your film that a lot of your film stuck out to me, but one part of your film that stuck out to me was his relationship with the outside world and his art. Meaning that he talks in the film, and I'm not going to put words in his mouth, and nor can I quote him verbatim, but things along the lines of, I don't have room in my life for love. He didn't have room in his life for love, to let too many people in. He was so single-mindedly focused on the art and on the work he was making. I think that's commonly held narrative about David Bowie, and sort of a narrative we hold about great artists, that they're solely brought to the work at the exclusion of everything else. And in your film, there's the turn where David Bowie, towards the end of his life, starts letting more love in. He starts letting more people in. I was really affected by that, and I had never seen that part of him before. I know you're not him. What do you think happened?
Well, first of all, the admission on a BBC talk show that I can let love into my life is not commonplace. I think that was for me, a great example of how people would say that he was icy and cold and guarded or whatever, or elusive. In that moment, he could not be more present and more authentic and more genuine. I mean, for someone an artist who actually admit that or state that is not, to me, is not common.
Yeah, especially of the era.
It's what happens. You know, it's like, yes, we get married and we don't really get married, but. So I found that to be just really vulnerable and an incredible moment. I think what happened with David is in the 80s, his mainstream success was not accidental. It was just another sea that he was going to swim or sail through. And he states that. That was another really shocking thing that, for me personally, just because I had never studied Bowie, was the idea that mainstream success was not an accident. It wasn't like this record particularly took off. He literally says, okay, I'm coming in from the wilderness. You know, I'm tired of being cold and icy, and I want to create some positive energy. And then he started to make a lot of money. And, you know, it's a classic Greek tragedy where, you know, he got stuck on that treadmill what he would later come to say for 3 years too long, from 84 to 87. And retrospectively, once, you know, looking from his interviews from 95, looking back at that period, he looked at it with absolute disdain and disgust and felt bankrupt and directionless and thought it was over. Didn't think there was anything left. And David did what he always did in those situations, which is change the landscape, change the environment. The first creative thing he did following the Glass Spiders tour was an experimental dance piece at the ICA in London. And it was breathtaking to witness because he was naked, so to speak, and totally vulnerable with this professional dance troupe. And it was like he was like shaking it up. And then he starts Tin Machine, which is the antithesis of where he was with the Glass Spiders, which is like a palate cleanser. And around this time, he meets Iman. And so I think that he was ready for another adventure, his kind of final adventure at that point. And he had finally arrived at a place where mainstream success wasn't doing it for him. That wasn't fulfilling whatever longings he had. But he had to go through that. He had to get to that bottom place so he could be receptive to love at that moment. That was the thing that was missing. And I think from that point, for the rest of his career, he didn't need to put himself in the middle of dangerous situations to create. He was able to continue to create some amazing music and art, but from the comfort of home.
This is a pre-tape interview, so if you don't want to talk about this, we don't have to, and no one will know. But if you want to talk about it, we can. I heard that you had a heart attack while you were making this film.
I'd first of all like to thank you for being so respectful.
Well, it's not a story.
As long as it's not the headline.
Listen, no, it's not going to be,
It's been really strange for me to see like clickbait headlines, like director has heart attack. I'm like, wait, we did a 2-hour interview and that's the headline.
It's a TikTok. This is going to be our TikTok.
No, I'm totally comfortable talking about it. January 5th, 2017, I was directing a pilot for Marvel called Runaways. And I left the production office. And at 7:30 that night, I had a massive heart attack, flatlined in the ER, fortunately, at Cedars-Sinai, and was in a coma for a week.
Oh, my God.
And first thing I said when I regained consciousness was, and someone told me it was a Saturday, I was like, I need to be on set on Monday. And the doctor was like, you're not going anywhere. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I'm directing a really important pilot for Marvel right now. I need to go. I was insane. And my wife was there. She was terrified. And I pulled the plugs out and left the hospital 2
You're
days
kidding
later
me.
and went to a casting session at ABC.
Oh my God.
I was a wreck.
Yeah.
I was an absolute wreck. My life was totally out of control, and even a heart attack, wasn't enough to slap me into growing up. And it was from that point that I started doing my deep dive into Bowie. And suddenly, he's kind of providing this infinite wisdom and guidance into how to lead a more balanced and sort of complete life in an age of chaos and fragmentation. And Bowie is like, you know, because he knows how to surf the chaos, he doesn't crack. You see what I'm saying? He's like bamboo. You know what I mean? And so
Right. I understand. I try to remove myself from it sometimes. I try to remove myself from the chaos, but you can't.
yeah.
You have to surf the chaos.
Yeah, so all of a sudden I realized that there was an opportunity to create something much bigger than just an immersive theme park planetarium show, and it could be this life-affirming journey. And in the true kind of Bowie sense, that the hope is, Bowie he thought of himself as a canvas, right?
Yeah.
And that for us to project onto. The more you listen to Bowie, the more you learn about yourself. You don't know anything about you don't learn more about David Jones,
Yeah.
the man who is behind David Bowie.
Yeah.
You really learn about yourself, right? And so the film was, again, going back to what we started,
Sure.
the film being designed to be the Bowie experience. That was part of my intent, was to invite you to go see a film about David Bowie, and suddenly you're thinking about your own life. You're wondering if you should come back to this job tomorrow, if you should mix it up and try something else, because life's short, and why keep doing the same thing over and over and over again? And you don't change it up because there's some reward or something. You just change it up to change it up so we can have these different sort of experiences.
You're doing all right now? You good? Like you're healthy?
Like,
you're
am I
good?
doing? Are you? Yes. Thank you for asking.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Jesus, buddy.
No, I'm doing great. I'm making this film was quite traumatic.
Yeah.
Because of my health at the time, the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because of my having a heart issue,
Yeah.
I was like really in isolation. I didn't have a staff. And we were 3-4 years overdue on the film. It's really stressful making it. But 7 years later, showing up to premiere it, I feel very much like I went on this crazy adventure. Nearly killed me. I won't do it again. But I'm really thrilled at what has come of it. And it didn't matter when I said what's come of it. I arrived at the premiere at Cannes this year, sort of for the first time, sort of feeling like really happy. Like I'm really nervous when I go to premieres, but this one I was just like, hey, you know what? It's gonna be some people like it, some people don't like it. Whatever it is, I really like it. I made the film I wanted to make, and that's it.
That's a beautiful film. Thanks for talking to me about it.
Thank you.